If you're looking to learn more about the world of international education, be sure to check out our book, International Education Leadership: Stories from Across the Globe. You'll hear from 13 different international school leaders from all parts of the world and backgrounds sharing what makes international education unique through their leadership lessons. And now, on with the show.
Somewhere out there, in a classroom or staying up late at home, a teacher is planning that next great lesson that will inspire and change a child's life. Whether they're looking for new, innovative ways to engage and motivate students, or connecting learning to real life in a hands-on way, it's always with the end in mind and the context of global citizenship and advancing our humanity. Join us on our search for leading voices in education across the globe as we convene to talk about the topics that matter and inspire all educators in the pursuit of that next great lesson. Welcome to Educators Without Borders, presented by SchoolRubric.
Well, hello there. I am really excited to be with you today, and my name is Wallace Ting. I'm part of the SchoolRubric team, and we do a lot of really interesting and cool stuff at SchoolRubric. We publish podcasts, we publish articles, magazines, we've got some online courses, we've even published some books. But one of the things I am the most excited about is a little series that we have called Educators Without Borders. And in this series, we really gather some experts in the field to come together and talk about some issues that really matter in global education. If you've been watching some of our past two episodes, we've really been doing a deep dive in international education, exploring recruitment and retention, how to get into the door of international education and how to stay in the door of international education. Today, we've gathered some experts to talk about another really important issue in international education, which is around diversity, equity, and inclusion. International education is very unique. It's very different. We've got culture and context, and it really matters the difference in how DEI work really manifests itself in international education. So today I have with us Erin Robinson, who's the head of secondary at the Atlanta International School, Darnell Fine, who's the middle school deputy principal at Singapore American School, and Liz Cho, the principal of teaching and learning at Korea International School. Pull them all on the screen. Welcome. Thanks for being here. So before we get going in the meat of our questions, we've assembled some great questions from some folks who want to explore and learn more about DEI work in international schools. I'd like to invite each of you to share a little bit more about yourselves and your work so that we can learn a little bit more. Liz, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. It's great to be here. As Wallace said, I am the principal of teaching and learning. And what I do in my role is to look at the vertical alignment of our curriculum K-12. I also am responsible for setting up professional development and learning for the teachers. And of course, working in partnership with all of us at the senior leadership team to ensure that our school mission and vision is adhered to, and setting goals and ensuring that we have steps to get closer to those every year.
All right. Well, Liz, thank you for being here and welcome to this discussion. I'll pass it over to Darnell.
I'm Darnell Fine. I always find questions like this hard, especially in interviews, but less about my title and less about the work that I do, like in a formal leadership role. Like any space that I go in, it's about freedom and liberation work and making sure that people who are often not seen or othered can be their full selves with people who aren't like them. So right now it's through the lens of middle school deputy principal and the teachers that I work with and the students that I work with. But I could be an engineer and the same thing would be true. I could be a lawyer and the same thing would be true. But at the core of it, it's freedom work.
Well said. Erin?
Yeah, so I'm head of secondary at Atlanta International School. And so that oversees 6 to 12, everything that goes with 6 to 12, and then also that sort of K-12 bridge. But I think the way that I view the work that I do is I usually say my job is to set up everything so that kids and teachers have what they need to do the learning. And that can be all kinds of different things. And definitely DEIJ work plays a huge part in that, because you need the access and all of those other things, that sense of belonging. And I think, similar to what Darnell was saying, if I wasn't in this role, I would be doing work around intercultural competence, helping people to understand one another. That is at the heart of what I do, whether it's in a school or outside of school.
All right. Well, thank you all for sharing a little bit more about yourselves and your work and your passions. And it was great, Erin, to connect with you again, because for folks who've accessed some of our back series or been along this journey with Educators Without Borders, she was part of our panel and discussion almost a year ago, I think perhaps even more than a year ago, talking specifically about this issue as well. And I think we've had, even in a year to a year and a half, a lot of evolution in this topic. And so I'm excited to catch up and kind of continue this work and continue this conversation. So as I said, we have 4 questions as prompts to kind of engage and launch this conversation. And so let's take a look at our first question around DEI and international schools. Diversity, equity, and inclusion may be talked about a lot, but not totally understood by all, particularly within the context of international schools. What do you see as some of the most common myths or misunderstandings about diversity, equity, and inclusion in international education? Maybe Erin, if you want to just maybe kick us off, and then we'll just, let it go from there.
Yep, sounds good. I think for me, it really boils down to exceptionalism. I think that is at the root of it, because those that choose to be part of an international school oftentimes are looking for diversity, but they're can be looking at just kind of a surface level kind of diversity, kind of calling out the image that you just showed, the flags, like that side of things. And so when people in international schools start to get pressed on DEIJ, intercultural competence, access, freedom, all those things, there's a pushback. Oh, not me, not us. And it's because of the sense of exceptionalism. It's not me, it's the things around me. And that can even happen, I would say, with those of us that are in the work. We're in DEIJ work, and sometimes you can tend towards this sense of exceptionalism. And I would say, too, along with the exceptionalism that you can find in international schools, is just if you're looking at that intercultural competence continuum, that minimization, we recognize that there's some things going on, but we don't understand kind of the depth of it, and things can get glossed over, and it's hard when it hurts. And so there's some avoidance of things that are painful. And I think those are some things that just feed into misunderstandings about issues of equity and inclusion in international schools.
Isn't it kind of baked into the character of international schools in terms of, most international schools are private, not public. Most international schools, accept students that, in terms of nationality, don't necessarily have host country status passport wise. And so, of course, international schools make this claim that they have, many, many different nationalities represented, thus are diverse in that particular fashion. And, by virtue of being a private school, to this exceptionalism, it's a private, quote unquote, elite group I mean, what would you say to that, Liz, Darnell?
Darnell, do you want to go ahead on this one?
Nah, he said your name first.
You know what? I would say, yes, it's true. I would say international schools are set up that way. I would say absolutely that is true. And within that, stating that as a fact and in the way that it was set up, I don't think excuses that we need to be doing this work right now. Even if we look at education, I mean, even just in curriculum and teaching and learning alone, we've been talking for 200 years about grading and systems and how to improve all the time. And things have changed, certain things haven't changed. But in anything else in this world, in the way that it is set up, we're always looking at how do we improve and how do we get better. And so if we already have a system that was set up that we didn't have anything to do with, when we rewind time, we weren't even alive when these systems were set up. But I think we as humans have to look at the fact that we should be improving and we should be growing. And I think that's extremely important to show to our students so that they can, as cliche it is, cliches are cliches because they're true, it's so that they can make a better world. And we need to really build that pathway for them. And sure, people who are going to, come at me or Darnell or Erin or anybody and say, that's why our kids are here, because we want them to be elitist. All right, well, whatever brought you here, you're here. And we really need to be talking about the things that matter. So yeah, it's not an excuse to say we shouldn't be doing this work. And adding on to what Erin said, that exceptionalism exists, but also I think one of the greatest myths that really stop the work or people misunderstand about it is that this is an either or, like that if we do this work, then we're going to have losses of all of these other things. But first of all, it's not about you in particular. It's not a personal attack about you. You need to get it out of there so that we get out of this either or mentality. Because it's about, gosh, I mean, can it be cliche? It's about the world. It's about the children. Like, we have to really do better. And as adults, we have to model that, learn, and get our students to see that and teach what's really important.
Yeah, like just to add on to what Liz was saying, that these systems existed well before any of us were born. And like Erin, I remember you and I having a conversation at our school before DEI in international schools was in vogue, and we were having these conversations. And to a lot of folks, they'll look at DEI in international schools and think it's a new thing. And that suggests or implies that the inverse of DEI, when you're talking about multiculturalism or monoculturalism, when you're talking about inequity, when you're talking about exclusion, those things aren't new. Those things have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, since the very inception of international schools. So DEI isn't new. It's not new in international schools. Folks have been engaging in this conversation from the onset of when our schools were established in the 1950s or the 1960s. So that's a big misconception that I often come across, that these things aren't connected to historical oppression and exclusion. One of the big things that always comes up, and part of it is by virtue of my positionality as a Black American educator, is that this is an American thing. That why are you exporting these DEI ideas from the United States? As if in Asia, as if in Africa, as if in South America, colonialism didn't exist. So all of these misconceptions and myths about DEI being new or DEI being American ignores history. And it ignores not just history, but it ignores the ideologies that we carry with us from our home countries. My dissertation chair said, when the Martians come to Earth, they're still Martians. Just because we fly from Atlanta or New York or wherever we come from and land in Korea or Singapore doesn't mean that our histories and our ideologies are erased when we land.
Wow. And maybe just a follow-up question to the group. I mean, we talk about this system of international education. It is what it is. It was created many, many years before any of us got into international education, perhaps were born. I guess, does it feel like we're fighting an uphill battle because of the system? And is the best way to just kind of try to make these incremental improvements despite some of these systemic issues? Or should we be actually looking at the system itself and asking questions, why is the system this way? And asking for change and suggesting for systemic changes?
I
Any
would say
thoughts
both.
there?
Both. Yeah. I mean, it's not kind of what Liz was saying about either. It's not an either or kind of thing. And I think because it is so institutionalized and it's hundreds of years of history that's behind all of it, even though, you know, international schools started really cropping up in the 50s. I mean, the reasons why those schools started in the first place predated that. And so it's just, it's everywhere. It's within everything. If you really start applying a DEIJ lens to everything, you'll just you'll make yourself crazy, really, because it's absolutely everywhere. And so you have to work at it from both ends, and you've got to make, and besides that, people are in different places. So there's the institutional side of things, but it's made up of people. And so it's people work as well as this institutionalized kind of idea and the structures. And so you've got to work with individual people and groups of people, as well as saying, hey, that is a barrier and we have to change that. That's not okay. Recruitment being one of them. That has to change. And there's some significant things with that. And at the same time, you're working with individuals and leaders and teachers and parents and students. Like it's all of it.
It's interesting. I mean, I guess, you know, I never, you know, when I studied to be a principal, when I studied to be a teacher, there's no DEI course. And so I'm learning a lot just through these conversations. And sometimes, I'll be honest, it feels very nebulous to me, and I'm learning every day. And I think it's important for us to have these conversations and to ground it a little bit more. With that said, perhaps we can move on to our second question. There was an interesting article that was posted on international education that's gained a lot of traction. Let's take a look at our second question and discuss on the other side. Bloomberg writer Natalie Obiko-Pearson recently gained widespread attention for an article entitled, "Elite International Schools Still Have a Systemic Racism Problem." What wonderings or reactions does this claim spark for you? So, in full disclosure, I'll share that I was interviewed for this article. So I did connect with Natalie. I noticed that she interviewed a heck of a lot of people, and, you know, not just myself, and did a ton of research. But I was interviewed and I shared my perspective, which hopefully added a little bit to her findings. And for those people who are watching, we'll put the link to the article in the video description so that you can click on it and be able to access it. But I guess the question is, what are your reactions? She makes the claim that elite international schools have a systemic racism problem, which I think to some people would be, you know, very agree wholeheartedly. And for other people, they'd say, wait a second, what are you talking about? This is crazy. This is a very strong statement. I know, Erin, you kicked off our conversation the last time. Darnell or Liz, would you care to start us off?
Yeah, I can start since you said my name first. There's a Black American proverb, and the proverb is, water is wet. Like, of course, systemic racism exists in international schools. I think where we get hung up, where people start thinking it's crazy, Wallace, is when we misdefine what racism is and what systemic racism is. Racism is about a system of ideas, beliefs, actions that privilege or deem white folks as being superior over people of color and their ideas, beliefs, and systems. And Erin alluded to this earlier, but our international schools were founded on those racist ideas. The corporations that were the underpinning of those international schools, well before those schools were built, are grounded in systemic racism. And to ignore the interconnectedness of white supremacy and whiteness in these schools, it ignores the very foundation of these schools. And it's not just, even if your international school has the majority of people of color as the student body, who are the teachers? Where does the curriculum come from? Where's the curriculum headquartered? What are the policies around teaching credentials and certifications? And which countries are you deeming as being valuable or worthy in saying that a teacher is qualified to teach in the institution? And to say that these things aren't interconnected with systems of racism, but also other forms of oppression, there's a myth of ignorance in saying that there isn't a racism problem within our schools.
Liz or Erin?
I definitely agree with that. I think, in our last question, as we talked about, to me, it's just a statement of fact. I don't know how else to approach that. Yes, they have a systemic racism problem. But like I said, I think in her article, she really deconstructs, her personal experiences. Those stories are really powerful in her reflection process to kind of see, oh, shoot, it took me this long for me to kind of go back and recognize this and really see it. It was right before my eyes and I didn't notice. And, the way that the children adapt to their environment, right? What they feel that they need to do without ever knowing how to name those things, that they're just kind of adjusting and being a chameleon to a society that tells them this way is the best way. The white way is the best way. Without, those exact words being said to them, the white way is the best way. So I think it just, what I find, this being just a fact, and the fact that we have to keep improving and doing better, here it is, what can we do to dismantle that system? I think we really have to start looking into the stories that people have to tell so that we can really get to a collective narrative that we have to say, like, this is happening, this is real, these are humans we're talking about, and get it out there as much as we can so that we can be part of that healing process. And I loved the way that Darnell has taught me about these things, right? Like that these healing conversations, these healing spaces, they're really important. And yes, this problem exists. Now what, right? It shouldn't be a debate about whether it does or not. I think we're wasting our time if that's the debate. Of course, some people have to learn that, and that learning is really important. But the question, this is not the question that we need to be spending time on, in my mind.
For context, it seems like Natalie's not only a reporter at Bloomberg, but she was also a former international school student. So she had a very interesting lens to report from her own experience in international schools. I was pretty floored that I read that one of the recruiting firms actually would categorize candidates. I don't know if you guys read that or caught on to that, but they shared that they would have a column for candidates. They claim to not do that anymore, but a column for candidates that were in column A, white, column B, black, or column C, other. Which I thought was just astounding. I don't understand why anybody would do that. I guess, Erin, just to maybe close us off on this question, it seems like from what Darnell and Liz have said, the answer is clearly yes. But I guess my question to you would be, to what degree? If the answer is yes, to what degree is this a yes? And how important is it to actually the education of our students?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yes, a resounding yes. And I think, to what degree? So I was describing this last week to some other leaders, and sometimes I think I'm quite visual. So imagery, visuals help me quite a lot. And for whatever reason in my mind, so I love Marvel, and Venom, this character Venom, and this black, like, tentacle kind of thing that is like in the walls is what came into my head. And to me, that is the institutional oppression. It's racism, but it's not just racism as well. Darnell said that earlier. I think we really have to reinforce that as well. Racism is one of the isms, but there are many systems of oppression that are within international schools because they are everywhere. And the thing I think with the article that also resonated with me, so I grew up in international schools. I am American, but moved overseas when I was 3 months old. And my entire childhood was in international schools, graduated from an international school, and then returned to work in international schools. And my parents were international school educators, started in the 70s in Ethiopia. So I have like this multifaceted perspective about international schools. And I would say, to kind of add on something a little bit different from what Darnell and Liz were saying, is that yes, it's the international schools, but it is also the place that the international schools are in, because every international school absorbs some of the culture and the country around it. Even if it tries to be a bubble, it's a porous bubble. And so, like, growing up, and especially in Asia, it's so many things. And Liz was saying the kids pick up on things, right? So, you know, some examples are like in high school in Asia, you know, kids want to pick up extra money. And so they get into modeling. And modeling would go to kids that are white, or if you were mixed, or even if you weren't mixed, but you were light skinned, you would get the jobs and you would get the money and your face would be all over the place. Whereas if you were darker skinned, there was no way. Like, that just wasn't going to happen. It's the clubs that you belong to, your families belong to, because that's the other part of this equation. The clientele are these international school families. And so what are the international school families doing? And what are they doing in the school? And also, what are they doing outside of the school? What does the network outside of the school look like? Are they in these bubbles where they really don't want to have anything to do with anybody else? And you go in and you're like, wow, I can't believe I'm in Korea or I'm in Singapore, because it doesn't seem like, it doesn't look like it. And so all of that to say, there's no way that it can't be institutional, because it is everywhere.
Yeah, Erin, you brought up, before we move on to our next question, maybe just kind of an offshoot, you talked a little bit about parents and families and kind of living in this bubble. And maybe if I could just play the devil's advocate for a second, if I'm a parent in international school, what would you say if I went to you, one of you as an international school leader, and said, you know what? I get it. Diversity is important. I get it. And I'm not denying that. But I'm sending my kid here to learn the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, you know, get good at academics. I don't understand why the school is spending so much time and resources talking about, focused on, working on DEI stuff. Why can't you just get back to the academics? What would you say to that parent? And I'm just playing devil's advocate here, but how would you respond to a parent that kind of took that position?
Oh, that definitely happens. A lot. So, you know, my response is really, I'm not actually here to just do the 3 R's. Like, that's not what the school is about. That's not the mission. That's not the values. If that's what you want, like, I'm not contentious at the beginning, but if it ends up being quite a difficult conversation, it ends up being, listen, then maybe we're not the right school for you, because what we are trying to do is we are trying to help students be global citizens. We're trying to help them with intercultural competence, all these other things. And the other part of the conversation I usually have with the parents is around definitions of success. And that's probably a whole nother topic we could get into. How are we defining success for students? And if that definition of success for students is singular in university admissions to elite universities, then there are all kinds of questions that come with that related to DEI and a focus on hyper focus on academics in a very narrow way of viewing it. But usually, you know, I'm quite gentle at first and trying to help them to understand that it's not just about the 3 R's. It is about all these other kinds of things. And it is about all of those social interactions. So depending on the age of the child, these social interactions that are happening in the hallways at lunch, it's about that and the learning that happens there, the social and emotional learning that happens, as well as the sort of cliched academic learning.
Can I add on to
Please.
that? Let's just say it is about the 3 R's. And I've never heard of that term before, but let's say it's about the 3 R's. And let's say it is about getting into an Ivy League institution. Like the schools that you want to send your kids to, these Ivy League schools, are engaging in deep conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you send your kid to Yale and they're situated in New Haven, or if you send your kid to Brown and they're situated in Providence, the community around them is also engaging in these conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you do a disservice for your kid if you're not engaging in conversations around diverse perspectives, or being an equitable citizen in the world, or being inclusive. Because those Ivy League schools won't want your kid if they find out that they've said something racist or done something sexist. That's number one. But if we go to the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic, to be a critical reader, you have to have a critical lens. You have to be looking through an inclusive, equitable lens when you read a story. You cannot fully understand Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon if you have no critical lens to read that text in. So you're not reading deeply. And when we talk about writing, if you're not considering how to break conventions and reinvent language with different inclusive ways of communicating, you're doing yourself a disservice, because professional writers do that. And when we talk about arithmetic, what's so incredibly powerful is how you use statistics for social justice. And when you look at economists and when you look at people who are looking at numbers for social justice, those are the things that have long-lasting impact on the world. So these things aren't disconnected. If you have a coachly responsive curriculum or a coachly relevant pedagogy, as Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings says, a part of that is meeting academic standards, but it's grounding it in those enduring understandings and those critical lenses, and having a socio-political consciousness, so that when you're actually doing those things, you're not doing them in a vacuum. You're learning to be a citizen of the world so that you can make the world a better place.
I wholeheartedly agree. And on a smaller scale, like Erin said, yeah, there are parents who would say that and ask that. And in my sphere of influence, I would say, come to a session, come to a parent session, because we're going to talk about why we do this. And let me give you a little bit of a history that would help you understand this. And it's funny because if I do like a map testing session, I have like 200 parents who will sign up and come. And then I'm like, oh, let's do, understanding, build compassion. Here's our goal. Like, we're going to talk about what that means. And I have like 30 parents who will sign up. And I'm like, right now thinking about, I should call it a map testing or a mathematics session, and then get them in there and put it at the beginning and the end, just put the meat of it all into the story. So it's there. I'm thinking how to do this. But I say this because when I have conversations with parents and get them to focus on their story and the experience that they're having with their children now as a result of what's happening to them in school, they pause and go, oh my gosh, that's what's happening right now. I kid you not, like, there have been powerful moments, and like those make me just hold on for, so much longer, because I'm like, that singular parent saying, wow, that's what I'm noticing in my kid. I see, oh, I am part of the problem. because I approach it as, I know you want the best for your kid, and that's why you're asking me this question. That's why you have this kid in our school. Every parent, I dare to say, every parent wants the best for their child. And whatever that approach is, they think is the right one, or they're trying to figure out the best one for that kid. So when you get them to sit down and go, look at what you're doing when you do X, Y, Z, and you get them to reflect on their own story and their experience, it's really powerful. And so a parent who says, sure, I want the 3 R's, but not this, I would say, just come and understand what we're about. And then getting to the point, right? Where Erin said, maybe this isn't the school for you. But like, before we get there, I think if we approach it with, that parent wants the best for that kid. We love that kid that we have at our school. We want that kid to have the best possible learning that we can give them. And this is the holistic approach, and we can't leave this out and just say 3 R's. They exist in a vacuum. They don't. So that is really powerful. I would say, come, let's have this conversation. Let's build a community. Let's build partnerships so we can make this happen.
Well, thanks for sharing, everyone.
If I can add one
Yeah,
other
please
thing.
go ahead. Please go ahead.
That I found really, one other thing I found really helpful is bringing the kid in, thinking about what Liz just said, bringing the kid into the conversation. Because what I've also found is that what the parent is saying is different from what the kid wants. There's this difference. And so bringing the child's perspective and what the child wants out of their education and centering on that also can help the parent, and you can kind of bring them around.
I agree with that, Erin. I think there's a parallel curriculum that occurs through social media and just student social interactions with each other. And I think parents would be surprised if they ever found out who their kid truly was. And this is through the lens of race, but also through the lens of LGBTQ identity, through the lens of gender, through a number of different lenses. So that resonates with me, Erin.
Thank you all for sharing. Let's keep moving on. We've focused a lot. We have some actual strategies here, and I want to start focusing a little bit more on some actions that we can do. Had a little bit of a theoretical discussion. Maybe it makes sense to kind of look at the recruiting agencies aspect of it as well and see what they're doing well, what opportunities there are as well. So let's take a look at our third question. There are some who would say that international recruitment agencies keep their proverbial head in the sand when it comes to influencing diversity, equity, and inclusion in hiring practices. What could or should these entities be doing differently or stop doing to catalyze broader change? I tell you what, the recruiting agencies, I have a love-hate relationship with them. I left international education back in 2019, but I've been on every side of it, from recruiting to being a candidate, and have had, obviously I'm very thankful for the opportunities I've had, but I've also kind of scratched my head and asked myself, why are some things happening the way they're happening? Liz, perhaps I can start with you, or we can start with you on this question. I know I'm putting you on the spot. We had Darnell and Erin start to kick us off on the other one. Do you have any reactions to kind of the role recruiting agencies play in especially DEI work?
Actually, it's funny, Wallace, because I was like, I hope he doesn't call on me first, because I kind of want to learn from the other two. Here's why I say that, because when I look at when I'm recruiting, right? And of course, I've been on either side as well, and I'm looking at CVs. Can I share a wish? I wish all the recruiting agencies work together to take off the criteria that that makes all of the white folks who speak fluent English as their first native language. I mean, all of the above. There are those little factors that are built in, just as the Pearson article says. And I get frustrated because I am in a position where I'm not really sure how to dismantle that. So that's a huge area of curiosity for me and learning. I know I'm frustrated by it, but what does it take in order to get them to change? I know that there are agencies that are changing their practices. You know, they are putting it out there to say, here's our commitment and here are the shifts. Beyond that,
I'll share. I'll just share a quick story before maybe Darnell and Erin can jump in. I was interviewing for a head of school position a few years ago in a country in South America, and I was one of the 2 finalist candidates. Actually, was flown down to the school, interviewed with the board, interviewed with the community, had a great visit. And in those kinds of instances, you have the recruiter who is on standby and kind of playing both sides, talking to the board, talking to you, and everything like that. And this recruiter shared with me, he said, Wallace, they really love you and they really think you're great, but some of the people on the board had a question. They wanted to know if you were really American. And he said, and they said, and he responded, and I was like, well, what did you say? Of course I am American. And they said, he says, well, I told them that you're about as American as American pie. And I just kind of brushed it off. I just kind of, okay. And it just felt really wrong to me. And it just felt really strange. And I didn't stand up for it, nor did I kind of have a conversation with the board or folks on the board to clarify or even ask for clarification. And needless to say, I didn't get the job. And of course, I don't know the reason that I didn't get the job. Perhaps that had something to do with it. Perhaps it didn't have something to do with it. But I do wonder, like, what role could a recruiting agency have done in that particular situation to make sure that my true strengths as a candidate were shown, as opposed to identifying me as American or not American and just kind of putting me in a box?
Mm.
They could have done a number of things.
Yeah,
okay. Go ahead. Go ahead, Erin.
Go ahead. I will tame my thoughts as I listen to you.
I always say you can't recruit into a burning house. And I think sometimes recruitment agencies, they get you in the door and they get you to break that glass ceiling, and then they leave you there on a glass cliff. And I think more work needs to be done with recruiting agencies to not only vet candidates, because it's very interesting. Like, I have to submit my letters of reference, my transcripts, my credentials, etc. What's the vetting process for the schools that are on your site? And I feel like there needs to be a DEI lens through that too, where we're ensuring that people from minoritized groups aren't being put in unsafe situations. So yeah, it's getting the job. And it sounds like there's a lot going on there, Wallace, with that particular institution. But it's also helping them once they get into the institution. I think there's some pre-work that needs to be done. And I think sometimes recruiting agencies or recruitment agencies leave it to the schools to do their own anti-bias hiring processes and training. I think that should be something that's built into the recruitment agencies when recruitment agencies are referring candidates to different schools. That shouldn't have been the first time your recruiter had that conversation with the board chair about biases. That should have been a proactive conversation that they've had with the school from the onset. And to go back to what Liz was saying, part of that work needs to be done not just with one recruitment agency, but those recruitment agencies need to work in concert with one another. There's more to it. I have a list of stuff, but I'll hold off. I want to see what Erin has to say.
Yeah, so I think the first thing we have to remember is that recruitment agencies are businesses. So we can't talk about them as if they're a collective, because they're not. They're trying to make profit. That's the bottom line. And they are providing a service. And the customers for that service, we have to look at that. And I think also, again, in this work, it is so easy to blame. And so there's a lot of finger pointing at recruitment agencies. But I think we also in schools have to point the finger at ourselves
Mhm.
And if we are choosing to use recruitment agencies and put money behind recruitment agencies who have practices that we don't believe in, then we're just fueling the problem.
Mm.
Mhm.
And so I think putting more pressure from a school perspective, and whoever is able to do that as candidates is an important piece of it. They're not going to significantly change if they don't have to.
Mhm.
And I would say too with that, I absolutely agree with what Darnell was saying in terms of the biases training. Like that should be a requirement. And it's sort of what do schools have to do in order to be able to work with that recruitment agency besides give money? Are there certain things that they have to demonstrate to be able to use the service? And then the other thing that I think about is actually two things. I really think that recruitment agencies, if they do want to provide a service to schools, whoops, sorry about that. If they want to provide a service to school where they're supporting greater diversity in school recruitment, they have to put in more effort. They have to reach out. I feel like I'm talking to myself.
No, you're
and
good.
I'm frozen.
We see you.
We can see you. We can hear you.
Let's see. Oh, I'm good. Okay. Okay, good. Right. Sorry. So with that, so they have to do more rather than waiting for candidates to come to them, because like what Darnell was saying, lots of people of color don't even know that international schools are a thing. And so if you're trying to get more diverse candidates into the pool, you have to make the effort to get them in. So what are they doing besides just sitting back and saying, oh, well, we'll try to diversify? What are they actively doing to try to bring in a more diverse pool of candidates? So I think they need to be more active. And I think too, in terms of the actual recruiters that work within the agencies, they must diversify who is working in those organizations. They're starting to with like more significant positions, a few, which is helpful, but that's like a person here and there. Like you really have to look at all of the employees and all of the recruiters that are working within those recruitment agencies. I will say for myself, as both when I've been a candidate for different leadership positions, when I've been headhunted for head of school kind of roles, when I have been a recruiter myself looking for candidates, hand on my heart, I have literally never worked with a person of color. Never.
Wow.
Not once.
Wow.
Never.
Wow.
And that is across, and as a candidate, that is across all kinds of recruitment agencies. I've never. It's just not happened. And so that is something they could do.
It's interesting, when I got my first head of school position, I won't share which recruiting agency it was, but when I got my first head of school position, I was so excited and so thankful. I felt this obligation to then turn around and continue to use them as the school. And, my first headship was at the American School of Abuja in Nigeria. And I just kind of, was very new and naive to the world of international school leadership. And I didn't really totally understand how the recruitment process worked. Lo and behold, we end up going to, the job fairs, and we're next to the Netherlands, we're next to Norway. We're not getting a ton of folks and candidates in the line looking to talk to us at the recruiting table. And I'm wondering to myself, what's going on? Why are people not getting in line? Why are people not interested? And then I go to, of course, I go to the recruiting website and I start looking at candidates and reaching out to candidates and emailing them and writing them messages. Hey, we've got a great program here. We've got a great school. Are you interested? And it just kind of dawned on me, why am I using this system that in this database? Why am I limiting myself to this? And why am I using a system in which, the recruitment agency is going to make money the more turnover that I have, right? Because you're paying on a per head basis for turnover. It just didn't make a lot of sense to me, but I just kind of felt this obligation almost because, wow, I was on the other side as a candidate and you did me right because I have this job because of the recruiting agency. So of course, now I have to use the recruiting agency. And I guess that kind of speaks to this game of musical chairs that seems to happen in international schools.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that conversation. Tough conversation. I love some of the thoughts that are being shared and some of the ideas that recruiting agencies might be able to implement. So hopefully if somebody out there is working at a recruiting agency and listening to this, some ideas to take back to your team. Let's move on to our next question. Talking a little bit more about grounding the work, but really focusing not necessarily on recruiting agencies, but your schools themselves, and identifying some challenges and some powerful practices. So let's take a look at question number 4. What are some powerful practices that you have been a part of or observed that resulted in positive changes around DEI in international schools? And what are some of the most significant obstacles to authentically implementing DEI initiatives in international schools? All right, well, I'm not going to call on anybody this time, but whoever wants to jump in and share a powerful practice that you've seen be effective, or maybe a challenge that you think should be identified specifically for us to look at a little bit more.
I could actually start this one if, it's a question I feel that I could answer. One thing, and I think as a powerful practice and an obstacle, this story goes hand in hand. I think the powerful practice, when we started doing the DIJ work at our school and said this is really important, we put it out in the forefront. We have to work with the entire community. So it can't just be the teachers, just because my role is to work with the teachers. It can't just be the students because they're in the classroom. It's got to be the business office as well. And it's going to be the parent community. And so for me personally, because I'm bilingual, I use that, and I'm in a country where my language actually is helpful to a significant percentage of parents and the business staff. So just kind of bringing in education that was not only just for the teachers, but really working in partnership with the business staff director and saying, what can we do to carve out time for them to hear the same messaging and for us to say this is powerful, and for us to reflect on how our students interact with us and what we can show them by example or by conversation or reactions. What are some of the practices that are deeply rooted within this school as well, within this country, when it comes to the elite systems and how we perceive them? So I think bringing and being very intentional about bringing everyone on board and having those conversations, because let's face it, I'm not going to live and die here and be here forever, nor is my current team, right? So what does it look like when we say longevity? We really have to look at the fact that the business office is going to be there for a long time. We really have to look at the fact that the owner owns this school. What are the conversations that we're having there that allows, this work to be continued? And then of course that goes in hand with the obstacles, because then there are so many minds that are set and ingrained in the old ways and in the ways that the schools were set up, like we talked about earlier. So shifting that is really difficult. But I think finding the partnerships and saying, this is not my agenda, this is not these couple people's agendas. We're really actually saying this should be the worldwide agenda for everybody. So what is it, and what does it look like for us, and how can we work on this together, and what is our why? I think could be a really powerful practice that should be seen everywhere.
Liz or Erin or Darnell, anything to share from your end?
Sure, I can go.
Okay. Go ahead, Erin.
No, you go.
I don't know.
It's okay, you go. I'll go last.
Okay. I struggle with this question because, of course, I have strategies and practices and all of that. And often folks are looking for the checklist. They're looking for the action plan. And that doesn't always translate to sustainable or transformative change within institutions. So I always worry about giving a list of practices or things to do. I think there's a step before the powerful practices. It's not just what are we going to do, but who do we want to be as human beings and as people within our schools. And I have a profound belief that people want to be good and they want to rehumanize themselves. So I think even before we talk about what are we going to do, it's like really being clear on who we want to be, whether it's our philosophy statement or our vision statement or just our own internal values. A significant obstacle for me is, and I've worked with a number of schools. I'm starting to scale back. This is one of my first conversations about DEI in a while, but I've worked over the course of the last several years with over 60 international schools. And they get the practices. They're not ignorant of these conversations. They know what systems they need to build. But there's a hidden commitment to the status quo. If we truly want to diversify our institutions, we could. But if you're talking about racial diversity and most of your leadership is white, how does that benefit them? So there's not a real commitment to diversify your international schools if it's a threat to your very existence and what benefits you. And I think there's a disconnect there. I think like we will have the list of practices, but there's still a commitment to the way things are, because international schools, the reason why we're in international schools is because it feels like 1960s Cape Cod. And we get all of the luxuries of America just relocated beyond the borders of the United States, for me and the teachers that not the teachers I work with now, but the teachers I previously worked with. I won't say the school in London that I used to work in. So I think there's a contradiction between having the practices and the significant obstacles being like these are institutions of privilege that we want to maintain and we don't truly want to disrupt. So I can facilitate a professional learning session where you increase your knowledge, but when it comes to the actual change, I'm not sure if folks are willing to give up their privilege to truly promote DEI in their personal and professional lives.
Erin?
Yeah. So kind of going off of that, I think one of the biggest challenges or obstacles that I see with DEIJ work in international schools, all schools, all organizations, just sort of the work itself, is that it's a change that is unlike any other change initiatives that we've had before. It's not something that is prescriptive. It is not like bringing in a particular reading and writing program. It's not any of those things because it's in your heart, and it's emotional work, and it is very hard emotional labor. And kind of going back to what we were saying about schools, international schools being racist and the foundation of it, one of the symptoms of that is that generally speaking in schools, we keep emotion out. And that is a particular cultural way of being. But you can't do that if you actually want to make change within DEIJ. you can put it on the strategic plan, and you can work through all these practices, and you can follow all these things, and you can check all the boxes. But until people are actually going to be willing to offer up the vulnerability of their heart and past harms that they themselves have participated in, and be willing to shift, it's going to be really hard to make that systemic kind of change. I mean, we'll still keep pushing it and keep doing it, but it is about that. And then I think the other thing too, something that Darnell touched on, is that the leadership matters. It matters a lot. And as schools are just getting into DEIJ and saying it's a priority and all these kinds of things, and, on the positive end, some schools are hiring a DEIJ senior leader, or they're making a team. It is still separate. And I think one of the obstacles is that, and it's just going to take time, there are not enough leaders who truly understand the work that we have to get to a point where they do understand the work, that they don't need a separate coordinator, that it's within the leadership team, and it's as fluent and as fluid as teaching and learning. Because if you think about your heads of school, you don't want a head of school that doesn't understand pedagogy. It has to be the same thing with DEIJ. You can't have a senior leadership team or a leadership team, period, that doesn't really get this work and is fluid in it. And that will just take time, because people aren't there yet. But I think that's something that we have to work towards. And then the flip side of it, because I'm always about like both ends, is empowering kids, really empowering kids to support their own growth, because so often in schools we do things to kids, and that's not the way it should be. It should be about empowering kids to do work that is meaningful for them, and be the facilitator and the guide for them to do that work with one another as well. So those are a few thoughts.
Wow. Powerful practices. Thank you all for sharing. And this has been an amazing conversation. I've learned so much from each of you, and really appreciate you taking the time and us coordinating the schedules to come together. And hopefully for those who are watching, you're able to pick up some things and start your journey or continue your journey of learning in this sphere. Before we close out, one of the things that we just wanted to kind of ask around, and I know maybe is something that you've already said that you want to reiterate, or maybe a piece of advice that you want to leave with somebody. Where can you start, or what can we do tomorrow? Or even if it's not an advice for somebody, maybe even something to yourself. What are you going to do tomorrow, to continue to advance this work and keep this at the forefront? So maybe we can just wrap up there as our kind of last prompt. Anybody want to kick us off here?
For me, maybe this is a good place for me to kind of contextualize me a little bit. Like, I learned so much from, having these conversations. And Darnell and Erin, I thank you so much, and Wallace, you too, for this space, because I'm here having this conversation and taking in a lot. And I think where you can start is just everything that I'm hearing here in my experience in the past couple of years. It is such an emotional and work of my heart. And I think we have to be vulnerable with ourselves first to be able to recognize that we have stories, and be able to deconstruct that before we can go on to do something else. I think it's starting with yourself and hearing your own stories said out loud, and being vulnerable and recognizing that that is where your strength comes from, and you begin to find those passions and avenues and the connections that you need in order to keep going, is a great start. That was a very hurtful and a painful process for me, I would say, and recognizing that I can name so many things that I couldn't before. So I would say start with you, see where you are, pause to think about where your starting point is, not trying to jump in and do things to a checklist.
Yeah, I think starting with your self is an incredibly powerful starting point, and having that critical self-reflection and really working on yourself and what you need to grow. And I also think you don't have to start with yourself. You can start with the organization. Look, let's do a time audit of how many meetings in your agenda are being dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's do a resource audit of or a financial audit of how much money are you giving to certain consultants versus others. Let's do a personnel audit where we look at the job descriptions and we see whose core responsibilities are being dedicated towards DEI. Let's do an organizational audit of the mission and the vision, or even let's do an audit of the physical space. And let's go around and see where we see on the walls of our schools, we see DEI being promoted. And I often say start with the self, and I was going to say that before Liz said it first. But I think another option or another pathway is starting with the organization, because that helps ease the burden of those trailblazers or those people who are making the path while walking, especially those outliers within our schools that are the ones that are start this work at the grassroots level. It helps ease that burden by making it an organizational or institutional thing, and not just one individual doing the book club, and then eventually that blooming out to organizational change.
Thank you, Darnell. Erin, any last words to close us out?
Yeah, I mean, I think both as an individual and then also institutionally, be willing and ready to be wrong, because we have to in order to address things and make improvements. I would also say, similar to what Darnell was saying, from an institutional perspective, having some data is really, really helpful. And you can get at that in all kinds of different ways. But having some data to see where you're at, because the first question about myths and misunderstandings, you have to uproot the assumptions about the organization and also actually with individuals. So audits, assessments, IDI, something, whatever it is that you can do at your school, I think is a good place to start, because then you can kind of say, okay, here's where we're at. This is the status quo. So you can figure out what to do next, because every school is going to have its own context. And then the other thing I would say, for the people that are in positions, senior leadership positions that are listening, don't just focus on the teaching and learning side of things, because it is institutional. What's going on the operational side as well? Where's the money at to address the barriers and the challenges? Because it is going to be expensive. There are things that you can do with the teaching and learning side of things that are not going to cost quite as much. You can do things in-house, that type of thing. But really, to make significant change, it's going to be expensive. And so where's the money at for that, for the personnel, for making some of those systemic changes that need to happen in the structure of the school?
Great point. Yeah, and just to Liz's point, folks at the business office are likely going to be in our international schools for a lot longer time than perhaps even the teaching and learning staff. So again, Liz, Erin, Darnell, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today on Educators Without Borders, sharing your perspectives on this really important issue. For those who are watching, make sure you check out some of those links. The article description is in the article that we talked about today is in the description. And then we'll also have links to our other 2 episodes on recruitment and retention as we explore this deep dive into the world of international education. Thank you again. Thanks for watching and learning with us at SchoolRubric with educators from across the globe. For more access to articles, magazines, podcasts, live episodes, our international school directory, courses, and more, visit us at schoolrubric.org. Thank you.